When you spend your whole life believing you're invisible, the worst part isn't being overlooked. It's the moment someone finally sees you and you realize you were never prepared for their gaze. That's how Lyra's story begins. The day of the great bonding ritual is the day dreams prove to be delusions. They'd been her refuge since childhood, these fantasies of finding her fated mate, of someone choosing her above all others, of the bond mark appearing on her wrist in brilliant silver instead of remaining the dull gray of the unmated. Growing up, she'd clung to the foolish hope that perhaps a kind alpha would see past her lowly omega status, that someday her unremarkable scent would call to someone powerful, that the shame of being forgotten would transform into the joy of being cherished. But hope was a treacherous thing, as it turned out, because when it's finally crushed, you suffer not just the pain of your circumstances, but the ache of having dared to dream at all. The morning mist clung to the sacred grove like ghostly fingers, refusing to lift even as the sun climbed higher. Lyra stood at the very back of the assembled Omegas, her plain brown dress a stark contrast to the silks and satins surrounding her. The bonding ritual happened only once every 5 years, and every unmated Omega in the kingdom was required to attend. At 22, she was among the oldest here. Most Omegas found their mates by 18. Those who didn't were considered defective, their sense too weak to attract a worthy alpha. Matron Vera, the stern woman who ran the Omega house where Lyra had lived since her parents died when she was 10, constantly reminded her of this harsh reality. "Stand straight!" Matron Vera hissed now, her voice dripping with disapproval. "You're representing our establishment, even if you're hardly our best advertisement." Lyra's cheeks burned with familiar shame, but she straightened her spine. Around her, the other Omegas preened and whispered, their excitement palpable like electricity in the air. They wore their finest dresses, their hair arranged in elaborate styles that must have taken hours, their pulse points dabbed with expensive enhancing oils to make their scents more alluring to potential mates. Lyra had none of these luxuries. Her mousy brown hair hung in a simple braid down her back, woven with nothing more than a strip of plain cloth. Her dress, while clean and carefully mended, had been patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the repairs. And her scent, what little there was of it, smelled of nothing more exciting than the herbs she tended in the Omega House garden. The drums began to beat with deep, resonant tones that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, signaling the arrival of the alphas. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs as the first figures emerged from the forest path like hunters seeking prey. These were the elite of their society, wealthy merchants with soft hands, respected craftsmen with proud bearings, minor nobles with entitled expressions, and warriors whose scars spoke of battles won. The ritual itself was elegantly simple in concept, brutally efficient in execution. The alphas would walk among the omegas, following their noses to find a scent that called to their inner wolf. When they found their match, they would offer their claiming bite. The omega could accept or refuse, though refusal was rare and often led to a life of shame and isolation. Lyra watched with growing melancholy as the first alpha, a broad-shouldered man with silver threading his temples, approached their group. His nostrils flared as he scented the air with practiced efficiency, and his predatory gaze locked onto Celestine, a golden-haired omega who stood near the front like a flower seeking sunlight. The girl's cheeks flushed pink with excitement as he approached, and when he extended his hand with formal grace, she took it without the slightest hesitation. The assembled crowd murmured approval as their bond marks flared to brilliant life. His appearing on his neck, hers materializing on her wrist, both glowing with the deep blue of a true mating bond. The sight made Lyra's chest ache with a longing she tried desperately to suppress, knowing such dreams were not meant for someone like her. One by one, the alphas moved through the crowd with the confidence of those accustomed to having their pick of available options. Some found their matches quickly, drawn by instinct to the Omega, whose scent sang to their wolf like a perfect melody. Others took their time, sampling different scents like connoisseurs at an expensive wine tasting. Each successful pairing was celebrated with enthusiastic cheers and well wishes from family and friends. Lyra remained untouched, unseen, forgotten in the shadows. She'd expected this outcome, had mentally prepared herself for it, but the reality still stung like salt in an open wound. As the morning wore on relentlessly and the crowd gradually thinned, she found herself surrounded by empty space. The other Omegas had either been claimed by satisfied alphas or had positioned themselves closer to the remaining unmated males, leaving her isolated at the back like a discarded afterthought. "Still here, I see," Matron Vera said, appearing beside her with false sympathy dripping from every carefully chosen word. "Well, perhaps one of the lesser alphas will take pity on you before the day ends. There's always a few desperate enough to settle for whatever remains." The words hit Lyra like physical blows, each one carefully calculated to wound and diminish. But she kept her expression neutral and composed, having learned through painful experience that showing hurt only invited more cruelty. Better to be invisible than to become a target for others' entertainment. That's when the royal trumpets sounded with fanfare that commanded immediate attention. The remaining crowd fell silent as death itself, as a new procession emerged from the forest with ceremonial pomp. Royal guards in midnight blue armor flanked a figure that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat like a trapped bird. Alpha King Kieran Blackthorn was even more imposing in person than in the formal portraits that hung in the Omega House common room. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the build of a warrior, with dark hair that gleamed like a raven's wing, and eyes the color of winter storms, he moved with the fluid grace of a born predator who had never known fear. But it was his scent that truly marked him as royalty among mortals. Raw power and ancient pine forests, lightning during summer storms and well-oiled leather. Something wild and completely untamed that made every Omega present go weak in the knees with instinctive submission. Even from her position at the very back of the assembly, Lyra could feel the overwhelming pull of it, the way her wolf wanted desperately to submit to such magnificent dominance. "His Majesty honors us with his presence," the High Priestess announced with a voice that trembled slightly with awe and carefully concealed fear. "The Alpha King seeks a mate to share his throne and bear his heirs." Excited whispers rippled through the remaining Omegas like wildfire spreading through dry grass. To be chosen by the king himself was the highest honor imaginable, a fairy tale come to life. His mate would become queen, would bear the next generation of royalty, would want for nothing for the rest of her pampered days. It was the stuff of childhood dreams, the fantasy every Omega girl harbored in the deepest corners of her heart. King Kieran's piercing gaze swept over the assembled Omegas with cool indifference that bordered on disdain. He was 31 years old, and had never taken a mate, claiming publicly that none had proven worthy of sharing his throne. The kingdom's council had been pressuring him for years to choose to secure the royal succession, but he'd resisted all attempts at arrangement until this moment. He began to walk among the remaining Omegas with deliberate slowness, his expression unreadable as carved stone. Lyra watched in fascination as he paused before the most beautiful among them. Seraphina, with her silver gold hair that caught sunlight like spun metal and sapphire eyes that promised intelligence and grace. The Omega practically glowed under his intense attention, her natural scent sweetening with arousal and desperate hope for royal favor. But after a long, considering moment that seemed to stretch for eternity, the king moved on without a word. He stopped next at Rosalind, an Omega known throughout the kingdom for her sharp intelligence and silver tongue. She curtsied with practiced grace, offering him a shy smile that had charmed dozens of lesser suitors over the years. Again, he studied her with that unreadable expression for what felt like hours before continuing his methodical circuit without offering any indication of interest. One by one, systematically, and without explanation, he rejected them all. Each dismissal sent murmurs of genuine shock through the crowd like ripples on a disturbed pond. These were the finest Omegas in the entire kingdom, each one beautiful beyond measure, accomplished in the arts expected of their station, worthy of any alpha's devoted attention. Yet none seemed to satisfy the king's impossibly exacting standards. Lyra found herself holding her breath unconsciously as he approached her section of the grove with that same measured pace. She pressed herself back against the ancient oak tree behind her, hoping its rough bark would somehow make her invisible to royal scrutiny. The last thing she needed was for the king to notice her, only to publicly dismiss her like all the others, adding royal rejection to her growing list of humiliations. But as King Kieran drew closer with predatory focus, something unexpected happened. His confident steps slowed noticeably. His aristocratic nostrils flared wide, and his head turned slightly as if catching an entirely unexpected scent carried on the morning breeze. His storm-gray eyes swept over the remaining Omegas with sudden sharp intensity, searching for the source of whatever had captured his attention. And then, impossibly, his penetrating gaze landed directly on her trembling form. Lyra's entire world tilted violently on its axis. The king was looking at her, really, truly looking at her, with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight and her breath come in short, panicked gasps. His eyes narrowed with what might have been recognition or interest, and he took a deliberate step closer that brought his overwhelming presence into her personal space. "You!" he said clearly, his deep voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent grove. "Step forward immediately." The grove fell so completely silent that Lyra could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like war drums announcing an execution. Every eye in the assembly was fixed on them with laser focus, every breath held in stunned anticipation. She could feel the shock radiating from the crowd in almost physical waves, could practically hear their collective thoughts screaming in utter disbelief. The king wants to claim her? The forgotten one? The worthless nobody who stands in shadows? "I dot." Lyra's voice failed her completely, the words dying in her throat like flowers touched by killing frost. The king's undivided attention felt like standing too close to a raging bonfire, overwhelming, dangerous, likely to burn her to ashes if she wasn't extremely careful. "Your Majesty," a smooth, cultured voice interrupted from somewhere in the crowd. Lord Aldrich Ravencrest, the king's chief advisor and closest confidant, stepped forward with barely concealed horror written across his aristocratic features like a tragic mask. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately before making any hasty decisions. Surely you don't mean to—" "I mean exactly what I said without any ambiguity," King Kieran replied sharply, without taking his piercing gaze off Lyra's trembling form. His voice carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question or delay. "I'm waiting for her answer, and I won't ask again." Lyra's mind raced frantically, like a cornered animal seeking any possible escape from an impossible situation. This had to be some kind of elaborate, cruel joke, perhaps a test designed to humiliate her even further before the assembled nobility. Kings didn't claim forgotten Omega girls who smelled like herb gardens and wore dresses held together with careful patches. Kings claimed beautiful, accomplished Omegas who could grace their throne with dignity and bear strong heirs worthy of royal bloodlines. "Why?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. The single word hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down, and she immediately regretted her boldness in questioning royalty. The king's dark eyebrows rose slightly in what might have been surprise, and for a brief moment she thought she glimpsed approval flickering in his storm-gray eyes like lightning. "You're questioning my judgment? I don't understand any of this," she said, her voice growing stronger despite her overwhelming terror. "You could have anyone here, anyone in the entire kingdom. They're all beautiful, all worthy, all everything I'm not and never could be. I'm nothing special, like I said. So why would you possibly choose me?" For a heartbeat that seemed to last forever, something fundamental shifted across the king's granite features. Surprise, perhaps even genuine respect for her honesty and courage. "You want the complete truth? Very well, I'll give it to you. Your scent calls to my wolf in a way that none of the others do, in a way I've never experienced before. When I breathe you in, I taste moonlight dancing on wildflowers, ancient forests untouched by civilization, and hidden streams running clear and pure. You smell like home to me, like peace I've never known." Audible gasps echoed through the crowd like ripples spreading across a still pond. To admit publicly that an Omega's scent affected him so profoundly was a show of vulnerability that kings rarely displayed, especially before an audience of potential political rivals. It was almost scandalous in its raw intimacy and emotional exposure. "But more than that," he continued, his deep voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow still carried to every corner of the grove, "you're the only one here who isn't desperately trying to impress me with false charm or calculated seduction. You're the only one who seems genuinely afraid rather than coldly calculating your next political move for personal advantage. And you're the only one with enough courage to question my motives directly to my face." Lyra stared at him in complete shock, her mouth slightly agape with disbelief. "Brave? Your Majesty, I'm absolutely terrified beyond words." "Exactly right." His lips curved in what might have been the ghost of a genuine smile rather than the cold expressions she'd seen in royal portraits. "True courage isn't the absence of fear, little Omega. It's choosing to act despite that fear when action is required. So I'll ask you one final time. Would you accept my claim and become my mate? The crowd pressed closer with obvious excitement, their whispers growing louder and more urgent by the second. Lyra caught fragments of shocked conversation drifting on the morning breeze like autumn leaves. She must have used powerful enhancing oils. There's no other reasonable explanation. Probably some kind of dark magic or witchcraft to bewitch him. Absolutely embarrassing for the kingdom to have such a queen. Enough of this nonsense, the king commanded sharply, and immediate silence fell like a heavy curtain dropping. The next person who speaks out of turn will find themselves permanently banished from my lands. This is between myself and Lyra, and absolutely no one else has any say in the matter whatsoever. The casual use of her name, spoken with such easy authority, sent another involuntary shiver racing down her spine like electricity. She looked around desperately at the faces surrounding them, some genuinely shocked, others clearly angry, still others calculating their next political moves with cold precision. These were the people who'd ignored her existence completely for 22 long years, who'd made her feel invisible and worthless. Now they hung on her every word as if their own fates were somehow tied to her impossible decision. Matron Vera stood at the edge of the circle, her weathered face pale with disbelief and something that might have been genuine fear. This was the woman who'd told her just that morning that she'd be fortunate if any alpha took pity on her before the day ended. I need to know something important first, Lyra said, surprising herself with her growing boldness. The words came out steadier than she felt, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The king's advisor made a choking sound of pure outrage, but King Kieran merely nodded with what appeared to be genuine interest. Ask whatever you wish to know. Is this real? She whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own racing heart. Or is this some kind of elaborate test, or punishment, or joke at my expense? I just can't believe that you, of all people in this kingdom, would want someone like me. For the first time since he'd approached her, the king's harsh expression softened around the edges like ice beginning to melt. The rigid lines of absolute authority relaxed slightly, revealing something almost vulnerable underneath the royal mask. Lyra, he said gently, and the sound of her name on his lips made her knees weak. Has anyone in your entire life ever told you that you're worthy of being chosen and cherished? Tears pricked her eyes like tiny daggers, threatening to spill over and humiliate her further before the assembled nobility. No, Your Majesty, never once. Then let me be the first to speak that truth. He reached for her hand with surprising gentleness, his fingers warm and steady as they closed around hers with protective strength. His touch sent electricity racing up her arm, and she had to fight not to gasp aloud at the unexpected sensation. You are worthy exactly as you are. You are enough, and more than enough, and if you'll have me, I would be honored beyond measure to call you mine. The sincerity in his voice broke something loose in her chest, some carefully constructed barrier she'd built around her heart to protect it from exactly this kind of dangerous hope. All her life, she dreamed secretly of someone saying those exact words to her, of being chosen and wanted and valued for who she truly was. But she'd imagined a gentle alpha from her own humble station, someone kind and simple who might overlook her many obvious flaws. She'd never dared to imagine a king offering her a crown. The political implications alone are staggering. Lord Aldrich began desperately. Are completely irrelevant to this decision. The king cut him off with ice in his voice. I rule this kingdom through right of birth and strength of arms, not the other way around. My choice of mate is mine alone to make. Lyra looked down at their joined hands, marveling at the stark contrast. His was so much larger than hers, scarred from countless battles and rough from sword work, bearing the calluses of a warrior king who'd earned his throne through blood and steel. A hand that could command vast armies and reshape entire kingdoms with a gesture. And he was offering it freely to her. The claiming mark on her wrist pulsed faintly, responding to his proximity like a flower turning towards sunlight. It had been gray and lifeless her entire life, marking her as unclaimed and unwanted by any worthy alpha. But now it seemed to shimmer with the faintest hint of silver, as if awakening from a long, dreamless sleep. Yes, she breathed, the word escaping her lips like a prayer offered to distant gods. What was that? He asked, leaning closer so his intoxicating scent enveloped her completely. His natural fragrance made her wolf whimper with want and instinctive submission. Yes, she said more firmly, looking up into his storm-gray eyes with newfound determination. I accept your claim, Your Majesty. The king smiled then, a real smile that transformed his severe features into something absolutely breathtaking. Without breaking their locked gaze, he raised their joined hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture both tender and unmistakably possessive. Then, by the ancient laws of our people, he announced, his voice carrying across the grove with absolute royal authority, I claim Lyra Moonwhisper as my mate and future queen. The claiming mark that blazed to life on her wrist burned like silver fire, brilliant and beautiful as it branded her permanently as his. On his neck, she could see an identical mark flaring to life, visible to all who looked upon him. The mystical bond snapped into place between them like a bridge being built, sudden and permanent and absolutely unbreakable. The crowd exploded into complete chaos, enthusiastic cheers from some, angry protests from others, shocked exclamations from all. But Lyra barely heard any of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the man standing before her, the king who'd chosen her when no one else would, who'd seen something valuable in her that she'd never recognized in herself. What happens now? She asked, still dazed by the intensity of the bond forming between them like golden threads. Now, King Kieran said, his eyes never leaving hers. You come home with me, my queen. The carriage ride to the palace felt like traveling between two completely different worlds that had never touched before. Lyra sat across from King Kieran, acutely aware of every small bump in the road, every sideways glance he sent her way, every breath they shared in the intimate confines of the royal vehicle. The claiming marks on their skin had settled into a warm, constant connection she could feel humming between them, like a living thing with its own heartbeat. The landscape outside the carriage windows gradually transformed from wild, untamed forest to carefully cultivated fields where farmers tended their crops, then to the bustling outskirts of the capital city with its crowded market squares and merchant stalls. Finally, they arrived at the palace gates themselves, where guards in pristine uniforms snapped to rigid attention. "You're unusually quiet," Kieran observed as they passed through the ornate entrance where towering iron gates worked with intricate designs opened before them like arms welcoming her home. Lyra stared out at the impossibly grand architecture, towering white spires that seemed to scrape the very sky, golden domes that gleamed like captured sunlight, and gardens so perfectly manicured they looked like living artwork. Everything was overwhelmingly beautiful, overwhelmingly expensive, overwhelmingly far removed from anything she'd ever experienced in her simple life. "I'm trying to convince myself this is really happening," she admitted softly. "Having second thoughts already?" "Every second," she said with brutal honesty, then blushed at her boldness. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I didn't mean to sound ungrateful for this incredible opportunity." "Kieran," he interrupted gently, his voice softer and warmer than she'd heard it yet. "When we're alone together, call me Kieran. And please don't apologize for honesty. It's more refreshing than you could possibly know." The carriage rolled to a smooth stop before the main entrance, where what seemed like dozens of servants waited in perfect military formation. As Kieran helped her down with courtly grace, Lyra caught sight of her reflection in the polished carriage window and winced internally. Her simple dress and practical braided hair looked even shabbier against the palace's overwhelming grandeur. "Lady Astrid!" Kieran called to an elegant woman with silver-streaked hair who stepped forward from the precise line of servants. Despite her graceful curtsy, Lyra caught the unmistakable flash of disapproval in the woman's sharp blue eyes. "Please see that Lyra is made comfortable immediately. She'll need quarters befitting her new station and appropriate attire for her position as my mate." Lady Astrid's response was perfectly correct and professionally delivered, but Lyra could hear the strain underneath like a tightly wound spring. "Of course, Your Majesty. Shall I place her in the Rose Suite with the other visiting nobles?" "The Luna Suite," Kieran corrected firmly, his tone brooking absolutely no argument. "She is to be treated with the complete respect due to my mate and future queen, not as a temporary guest." If Lady Astrid was shocked by this pronouncement, she hid it well behind years of courtly training and professional composure. "As you wish, Your Majesty. I shall see to the arrangements immediately." Kieran turned to Lyra, his expression softening in a way that made her heart skip several beats. "I have urgent council meetings that cannot be postponed, matters of state that require my immediate attention and decision. Lady Astrid will help you settle in properly and orient you to palace life and expectations. We'll dine together this evening, and I'll answer any questions you might have." After he left, striding away with that predatory grace that marked him unmistakably as an alpha in his prime, Lady Astrid led Lyra through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever into the distance. The walls were lined with priceless tapestries depicting ancient battles and royal hunts, while marble statues of long-dead kings watched their passage with stone eyes that seemed to judge her worthiness. Servants they passed dropped into practiced bows and curtsies with mechanical precision, but Lyra could feel their curious stares following her like physical touches. She caught fragments of whispered conversations that cut like tiny blades drawn across tender skin. "That's her? Really? She looks so ordinary. poor thing looks absolutely terrified of her own shadow. Wonder how long this particular arrangement will actually last. Lady Astrid mentioned casually as they climbed a grand staircase with steps so wide an entire family could walk comfortably abreast. Not since the late Queen Isabel passed from the wasting sickness that claimed her life. The weight of that seemingly casual statement settled on Lyra's shoulders like a lead cloak. She was expected to fill the shoes of a queen, a real queen who'd been beloved and accomplished and worthy, not some forgotten Omega girl who'd stumbled into good fortune through sheer chance. When Lady Astrid opened the double doors to the Luna suite with ceremonial flourish, Lyra's breath caught painfully in her throat. The sitting room alone was larger than the entire Omega house where she'd spent her life, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked manicured gardens stretching to the distant horizon. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases that probably cost more than most families earned in a year, and a cheerful fire crackled in a marble fireplace large enough to house a small carriage. "These will be your personal quarters until the royal wedding," Lady Astrid explained with professional efficiency, leading her through rooms that seemed designed for giants rather than mortals. "The bedroom, dressing room, private study, and bathing chamber. Your ladies-in-waiting will attend you here and help prepare you for your new duties and responsibilities." "Ladies-in-waiting?" Lyra repeated faintly, the words sounding foreign and impossible on her tongue. "3 young noblewomen specially chosen to assist with your daily needs and help prepare you for the complex requirements of royal life. They should arrive within the hour." Lady Astrid's tone suggested she found the entire situation personally distasteful, but was too well-bred to say so directly. "I've also taken the liberty of summoning the royal seamstresses. Your current attire is insufficient for your new position." Lyra looked down at her carefully patched dress, shame burning in her chest like acid. Everything about her was insufficient, inadequate, completely wrong for this glittering world of privilege and power. "Of course, I understand completely. The seamstresses will need to work with exceptional speed," Lady Astrid continued with barely concealed impatience. "His Majesty has announced that your formal engagement ceremony will be held in exactly 3 days' time. The entire court will be in attendance, along with representatives from neighboring kingdoms." 3 days? Lyra sank into a silk-upholstered chair that probably cost more than most people earned in several years, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the crushing magnitude of what lay ahead. In 3 days, she'd be officially engaged to marry the king in front of hundreds of nobles who already thought she was unworthy, not to mention foreign dignitaries who would judge the entire kingdom based on their ruler's choice of bride. The ladies-in-waiting arrived precisely 1 hour later, as if summoned by some invisible royal signal. Lady Celeste was a blonde beauty with perfect manners and calculating eyes that seemed to catalogue every flaw and weakness. Lady Meredith appeared genuinely kind but nervous, stumbling over her words whenever she looked directly at Lyra. Lady Vivian watched everything with sharp intelligence, as if studying a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. The royal seamstresses followed in their wake like a small army of determined artisans carrying bolts of silk and satin in every color imaginable. They clucked and tutted as they took Lyra's measurements with professional efficiency, their whispered comments not quite quiet enough to miss. Such an unusual choice for His Majesty to make. Hardly the figure we typically work with for royal gowns. We'll do our absolute best, but we can only work with what we have. Each seemingly innocent comment was like a small cut, reminding Lyra with painful clarity of how utterly out of place she was in this glittering world of wealth and privilege. By the time they finished their meticulous work, her nerves were completely frayed, and her fragile confidence had shattered like spun glass. "I need some fresh air," she told Lady Celeste, who immediately rose to accompany her with the kind of dedicated attention that felt more like surveillance than service. "Oh, you needn't trouble yourself," Lyra began hopefully. "I'm afraid I must insist on accompanying you, my lady," Celeste said with a bright smile that didn't reach her calculating eyes. "For your safety and proper protocol, of course. We wouldn't want anything untoward to happen during your first day." The palace gardens offered blessed relief from the suffocating atmosphere of ceremony and constant judgment. Ancient trees provided cool shade from the afternoon sun, while fountains created a soothing backdrop of flowing water that helped mask the sound of her racing thoughts. Lyra found a secluded marble bench beside a rose garden and sank onto it gratefully, breathing in the familiar scent of growing things. "You look completely lost." Lyra spun around in surprise to find a young man leaning against a nearby tree with casual elegance. He was handsome in a roguish way, with dark hair that looked deliberately tousled and laughing green eyes that sparkled with mischief. His clothes marked him clearly as nobility, though not of the very highest rank. "I'm sorry," she said, starting to rise with automatic deference. "I didn't realize anyone else was here. I can leave if this area is reserved. Please, don't get up on my account." He pushed off from the tree and approached with the kind of easy confidence that spoke of privilege and excellent education. "I'm Lord Marcus Thornfield, and you must be the mysterious Omega who's managed to capture our famously resistant king's heart." Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks at his direct words. "I'm Lyra. Just Lyra." Just Lyra? How refreshingly honest and unpretentious. He glanced around, noting that Lady Celeste had positioned herself within earshot, but not quite close enough to overhear their private conversation. "Tell me, Lyra, are you genuinely happy with this sudden and dramatic change in your circumstances?" The unexpected question caught her completely off guard. What do you mean, exactly?" "It's a simple question, really. You've just gone from complete obscurity to the highest position in the entire land. Most people would be dancing with joy, celebrating their incredible fortune. But you look absolutely terrified." Lyra studied his face carefully, searching for the mockery or cruelty she'd learned to expect from nobles who spoke to her. Instead, she found genuine curiosity and something that might have been sincere sympathy. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," she admitted quietly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't know if I can be what everyone expects." "And what, in your opinion, makes someone the right person to be queen?" "Beauty, intelligence, noble breeding, political connections, accomplishments, and education." She gestured to herself helplessly. "Everything I don't have and never will." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with more seriousness than she'd expected from someone who seemed so carefree. "You know," he said finally, "the last queen had all of those things in abundance. Beauty that could stop conversations mid-sentence, intelligence that impressed the wisest counselors, the highest breeding in all the land, connections to every important family in the kingdom. Lyra's head snapped up with sudden interest. And she was profoundly, desperately miserable. She spent most of her marriage locked away in her chambers, slowly wasting away from loneliness and the crushing weight of everyone's expectations. His expression grew serious. Perhaps what our king needs isn't another perfect queen. Perhaps he needs someone real, someone who understands what it means to struggle. Before Lyra could respond to this startling revelation about the previous queen, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. King Kieran emerged from the palace with purposeful strides, his expression shifting to something thunderous when he spotted them together in intimate conversation. "Lord Marcus?" he said, his voice carrying a dangerous undercurrent that spoke of barely leashed territorial instincts. "I wasn't aware you'd returned from your diplomatic mission to the eastern provinces." Marcus straightened, but didn't look particularly worried by the king's obvious displeasure. "Just arrived this afternoon, Your Majesty. I was introducing myself to your lovely mate and offering my sincere congratulations on your excellent choice." The possessiveness in Kieran's gaze as it moved between them was unmistakable and oddly thrilling to witness. "I'm sure you were. Perhaps you should report to Lord Aldrich about your mission's success rather than lingering in the gardens." It was clearly a dismissal couched in polite terms. Marcus bowed with exaggerated elegance. "Of course, Your Majesty. Lady Lyra, it was truly a pleasure meeting you." After he left, Kieran joined Lyra on the marble bench, his posture still rigid with barely controlled tension. "What were you discussing with Lord Thornfield?" "Nothing particularly important," Lyra said automatically, then remembered his earlier request for complete honesty. "He asked if I was happy with all this." "And what did you tell him?" She met his eyes directly, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide behind royal composure. "I told him I was scared." "Of me?" "Of failing you. Of being a disappointment to everyone who's watching and judging." She looked down at her hands, still unable to believe they bore a queen's claiming mark. "Everyone expects me to fail, you know. I can see it in their faces, hear it in their whispered conversations." Kieran was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd ever heard it. "Lyra, look at me." She raised her eyes to his, struck once again by how impossibly beautiful he was, like something carved from marble by master sculptors and brought to life by divine intervention. "The only opinion that truly matters is mine," he said firmly, his gray eyes intense with conviction. "And I chose you, not because you're perfect, but because when I breathe in your scent, something in my chest unclenches for the first time in years. When you look at me, I don't see calculation or ambition or political maneuvering. I see honesty, courage, and a kind of strength that can't be taught or faked." She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she understood what he saw in her that others missed. "Good. Now, shall we go in to dinner? I believe Cook has prepared something special in honor of your arrival." As they walked back toward the palace together, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking toward either her greatest triumph or her most spectacular failure. In 3 days, she'd be officially engaged to this man, this king, who seemed to see something in her that she'd never seen in herself. She only hoped she could find a way to live up to whatever it was he saw, before the weight of everyone's expectations crushed her completely. The engagement ceremony was a glittering spectacle that felt more like a public execution to Lyra's overwhelmed senses. She stood beside Kieran on the palace's grand balcony, wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that the royal seamstresses had worked around the clock to complete. The claiming mark on her wrist had been highlighted with delicate silver embroidery that caught the light with every movement, marking her unmistakably as the king's chosen mate for all to see. Below them, hundreds of nobles filled the courtyard like a sea of silk and precious jewels, their faces upturned in expressions ranging from polite curiosity to barely concealed skepticism to outright hostility. Foreign dignitaries occupied places of honor, their presence adding international weight to what should have been a celebration, but felt more like a trial by fire. Lyra's hands trembled uncontrollably as she gripped the marble balustrade, trying desperately to project a confidence she didn't feel. The weight of so many eyes was absolutely crushing, each gaze feeling like a physical touch, judging her appearance, her posture, her worthiness to stand beside their king. "Breathe slowly and deeply," Kieran murmured beside her, his voice pitched so low only she could hear. "You're doing perfectly. They can sense fear like predators, but they respect strength even more." But Lyra could hear the whispered conversations, even from this great height, carried on the evening breeze like poison designed to wound. "She's pretty enough, I suppose, but hardly what one would call queenly material. I heard she was living in an Omega house like a common servant before this. What could His Majesty possibly see in such an unremarkable creature? Mark my words, this unfortunate arrangement won't last the year." The high priestess concluded the formal announcement with a blessing that seemed to go on forever, her ancient voice calling upon the gods to witness and sanctify this union. When she finally finished with ceremonial flourish, the crowd erupted in polite applause that sounded hollow and forced to Lyra's sensitive ears. Kieran raised their joined hands high above their heads, and the claiming marks blazed with silver light that was visible even to those in the very back of the massive courtyard. "My lords and ladies," his voice carried across the space with absolute royal authority, "I present to you my chosen mate and your future queen, Lady Lyra Moonwhisper." More applause followed, though Lyra noted with growing unease how many faces below remained stony and completely unconvinced. As they turned to go back inside the palace, she caught sight of a familiar figure in the crowd. Matron Vera, wearing her finest dress, but still looking thoroughly out of place among the wealthy nobility. The woman who had raised her with constant criticism and disappointed sighs now stood, watching her ward become a queen. Their eyes met for a brief moment across the distance, and Lyra saw something she'd never seen before in Matron Vera's weathered expression. Regret, perhaps, or the dawning realization that she'd been terribly wrong about the girl she'd dismissed as worthless. The reception afterward proved even more challenging than the ceremony itself. Lyra found herself surrounded by nobles who smiled with their mouths, while their eyes remained cold and calculating. They asked pointed questions about her background, her education, her plans for the kingdom, all carefully designed to highlight her inadequacies and expose her as the fraud they believed her to be. "Tell me, Lady Lyra," said Duchess Evelyn Fairfax, a woman whose beauty was as sharp and cutting as her silver tongue. "What experience do you have in managing a royal household? The late Queen Isabel oversaw 17 different departments and maintained personal correspondence with diplomatic contacts across 6 kingdoms." I'm sure I have much to learn," Lyra replied carefully, feeling heat creep up her neck like a spreading rash. Every word felt like a confession of her complete inadequacy. "Indeed," the Duchess agreed with false sweetness that dripped like honey-coated poison. "Perhaps you might benefit from studying Queen Isabel's extensive personal journals. She was quite meticulous in documenting proper royal protocols and expectations." Before Lyra could respond to this thinly veiled insult, another voice cut through the conversation like a blade through silk. "Duchess Fairfax!" Lord Marcus appeared at Lyra's elbow with perfect timing, offering the Duchess a charming smile that somehow managed to seem genuinely threatening. "How lovely to see you spreading your particular brand of wisdom and encouragement. Tell me, how is your eldest son faring these days? Still struggling with those unfortunate gambling debts, I hear?" The Duchess's face paled visibly beneath her carefully applied cosmetics. "Lord Marcus, I hardly think this is the appropriate time or place for such— Oh, but I do think it's quite appropriate," he continued with silky smoothness that promised danger. "I find it fascinating how much one learns about the true character of our nobility when they assume no one of real importance is paying attention to their behavior." The Duchess excused herself hastily, practically fleeing to the safety of another conversation circle. Marcus turned to Lyra with a genuine smile that warmed her more than she cared to admit. "Enjoying your engagement party?" he asked with barely suppressed amusement. "Immensely," Lyra replied dryly. "Nothing I love more than being dissected in public by people who've already decided I'm completely unworthy." Marcus laughed, a rich sound that drew curious glances from nearby conversations. "There's that refreshing honesty Kieran mentioned. Good to see they haven't managed to beat it out of you yet with their protocols and expectations." "Yet being the operative word— Oh, they'll certainly try. Court has a way of grinding down anything real or authentic until it fits their narrow definitions of propriety. But I have a feeling you're made of much sterner stuff than they realize." Before Lyra could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, Kieran appeared at her side with the swift silence of a hunting cat. His expression darkened visibly when he saw Marcus standing so close to her. "Thornfield," he said coolly, his voice carrying undertones that spoke of barely leashed territorial instincts. "Don't you have somewhere else you need to be?" "Actually, no," Marcus replied with cheerful defiance. "I was just telling your lovely mate how much I admire her resilience in the face of these political vultures. She's handling their attacks with remarkable grace." Kieran's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lyra doesn't need your protection." "Doesn't she?" Marcus's tone remained light, but his eyes grew serious. "Because from where I'm standing, she's been thrown to the wolves with very little preparation or support. A lesser person might have crumbled under the pressure by now." The tension between the two men was palpable, crackling in the air like electricity before a violent storm. Lyra found herself stepping between them, before the situation could escalate further. "Perhaps we should—" she began. "Your Majesty?" Lord Aldrich appeared with his usual impeccable timing, though his face was grim with obvious urgency. "The delegation from the Northern Territories has arrived ahead of schedule. They're requesting an immediate audience regarding the border disputes." Kieran hesitated, clearly unwilling to leave Lyra alone with Marcus and the circling court predators. "It can wait until tomorrow morning." "I'm afraid it cannot, sir. They've brought news of renewed hostilities that require your immediate attention and response." Lyra could see the conflict warring in Kieran's features, duty against desire, responsibility against protectiveness. "Go," she said softly, touching his arm with gentle fingers. "I'll be fine. This is important." He looked like he wanted to argue, but years of kingship had taught him to prioritize the kingdom's needs above personal desires. "I'll return as quickly as possible," he promised, then turned to Marcus with a warning look that could have frozen summer itself. "Behave yourself, Thornfield." After Kieran left, Marcus offered Lyra his arm with exaggerated formality. "Shall we escape to the gardens before the next wave of social assassins descends? I suspect you could use some air that isn't poisoned with false courtesy." The gardens provided blessed relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the reception. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the soft sound of fountains masking their footsteps and providing privacy from potential eavesdroppers. "You're not what I expected," Marcus said eventually, his tone more serious than she'd heard from him before. "What did you expect?" "Someone more calculating, I suppose. The kind of woman who would use her sudden elevation to seek revenge on those who wronged her, or to accumulate power for its own sake." He glanced at her sideways. "But you seem genuinely overwhelmed by all this, almost innocent in your reactions." "Because I am overwhelmed," Lyra admitted, stopping beside a fountain whose dancing water caught moonlight like liquid diamonds. "A week ago, I was nobody special. Now I'm supposed to be a queen, and I have absolutely no idea how to do any of it successfully." "What if I told you that the key to being a good queen has nothing whatsoever to do with protocol or politics, or knowing which fork to use at elaborate state dinners?" "What do you mean?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The late Queen Isabel, for all her perfection and accomplishments, never really knew the people she ruled. She lived in an ivory tower of privilege, surrounded by luxury and flattery, completely insulated from the struggles of ordinary citizens." "That hardly seems like a failing. Isn't that what royalty is supposed to do?" "Is it?" He turned to face her fully. "Lyra, this kingdom has been ruled by perfection for generations. Beautiful, educated, well-bred rulers who never had to wonder where their next meal was coming from or whether they'd have a roof over their heads tomorrow. And what has that gotten us? A court full of sycophants and a people who feel increasingly disconnected from their leaders." Lyra frowned, considering his words. "You're saying the kingdom needs an imperfect queen?" "I'm saying it needs a real one. Someone who remembers what it feels like to be forgotten, to struggle, to fight for every scrap of dignity and respect." His expression grew earnest. "But they won't make it easy for you. The nobles will test you constantly, trying to prove you don't belong. And some of them will do far more than just test." A chill ran down Lyra's spine, despite the warm evening air. "What do you mean by that?" Before Marcus could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Lady Celeste emerged from the shadows between the trees, her face flushed with exertion and something that might have been excitement. "My lady," she said breathlessly, "His Majesty has concluded his meeting and is looking for you. He seemed quite concerned when he couldn't locate you immediately." As they walked back toward the palace, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had been trying to warn her about something specific and dangerous. But warn her about what, exactly? She found her answer the very next morning. Lyra woke to find Lady Astrid waiting in her sitting room with barely concealed agitation radiating from every line of her perfectly composed figure. "My lady," she said without preamble, "there's been what one might call a significant situation that requires immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" Lyra asked, though she suspected she wasn't going to like the answer. "Several of the most prominent noble families have submitted a formal petition to the Royal Council, questioning the validity of your claim to the throne." Lady Astrid's voice was carefully neutral, but Lyra could see the satisfaction gleaming in her eyes like a hidden blade. "They're calling for a test of worthiness to be conducted immediately." Lyra felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. "What exactly is a test of worthiness?" "An ancient law that allows the nobility to challenge a royal mate's fitness to rule when they believe the choice was made in error or haste. If the challenge is formally accepted, the mate must prove their worthiness through a series of trials designed to test their character, wisdom, and strength." Lady Astrid shrugged with feigned indifference. "If they fail any portion of the testing, if they fail, the mating bond can be dissolved by royal decree, and the king must choose another mate within 1 year's time." Lyra sank into the nearest chair, feeling the room spin around her like a child's top. This was it, the trap that had been waiting for her all along, the proof that she truly didn't belong in this glittering world of power and privilege. Can Kieran refuse the challenge? "He could," Lady Astrid admitted with obvious reluctance, "but it would be seen as an admission that he doubts your abilities and fitness himself. The political ramifications could be quite significant for his reign and authority." So this was the test Marcus had tried to warn her about, the proof that she truly didn't belong in this rarefied world. Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of inevitability settling on her shoulders like a lead shroud. "When will the king make his decision?" she asked quietly. "He's meeting with the full council at this very moment, my lady." Lyra nodded numbly, though inside she felt like screaming. She'd known this fairy tale was too good to be true, too perfect to last. Kings didn't really choose forgotten Omega girls from the dregs of society, and when they did, there were always consequences to pay. But as she sat there drowning in self-pity and despair, something Marcus had said the night before echoed in her mind with stubborn persistence. "I have a feeling you're made of much sterner stuff than they realize." Maybe she was. Maybe it was finally time to find out exactly what she was made of. The forgotten Omega girl was about to discover just how much fight she actually had in her. Kieran found her in the garden where they'd first walked together, sitting on the same marble bench where she'd confessed her deepest fears about inadequacy and belonging. He approached slowly, his expression unreadable as carved stone, and Lyra's heart sank like a stone dropped in deep water. She could see the decision written in his rigid posture before he even opened his mouth to speak. "You accepted the challenge," she said quietly, the words tasting like ashes on her tongue. He sat beside her with careful deliberation, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his powerful body like heat from a forge. "I had to accept it, Lyra. I had no real choice in the matter." "No, you didn't have to." She turned to face him fully, studying the sharp, aristocratic angles of his face in the morning light. "You could have refused outright. You could have protected me from this public humiliation. And spent the rest of our lives, however long they might be, dealing with constant whispers that I knew you were unworthy but was too besotted to admit it." His voice was rough, with barely controlled emotion. "Lyra, you don't understand the political realities at play here. If I had refused the challenge, they would have spent every single day of our marriage waiting for you to fail, questioning every decision you made, undermining your authority at every possible turn." She wanted to argue with his logic, but she could see the painful truth in his reasoning. "What exactly are the trials I'll face?" 3 tests conducted over 3 consecutive days. First, a formal demonstration of intellect and wisdom before the assembled court. Second, a test of character and compassion involving real judgments that will affect our citizens' actual lives. Third, ... He hesitated, and she could see reluctance in every line of his body. "Third what, Kieran?" "A trial by combat to prove your strength and worthiness in battle." Lyra's stomach dropped like a stone falling into an abyss. "Combat? But I'm an Omega with no training in weapons or fighting. I wouldn't last 30 seconds against any real warrior." "The ancient law allows for a champion," Kieran interrupted quickly, relief evident in his voice. "You can choose someone to fight in your name and on your behalf. And if my chosen champion loses the combat?" The silence that stretched between them was answer enough. Death. Failure. The end of everything they'd barely begun to build together. "Who's organizing and overseeing these trials?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "A council of 5 noble families, led by Duke Reginald Blackwood." Kieran's expression darkened like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. "He's opposed my rule since the day I took the throne. This challenge is as much about undermining my authority as it is about testing your worthiness." Lyra nodded grimly, pieces of the political puzzle clicking into place with ominous clarity. "He wants to choose your queen himself, doesn't he?" "He wants to choose everything himself," Kieran corrected with bitter accuracy. "But that's not your concern or burden to bear. Your focus should be entirely on preparing for the trials ahead." They sat in contemplative silence for several long moments, the weight of the coming challenges pressing down on them both like a physical force. Birds sang in the trees overhead, oblivious to the human drama unfolding beneath their branches. "Kieran," Lyra said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "what happens if I fail? What happens to us?" He turned to look at her directly, his storm-gray eyes intense with conviction and something deeper. You won't fail. I have complete faith in your abilities. But what if I do fail? I need to know what we're risking here. Then we'll face whatever consequences come together, he said firmly, reaching for her hand and threading their fingers together with gentle strength. But I need you to understand something crucial, Lyra. Win or lose, succeed or fail, I chose you. And I will continue choosing you every single day, whatever the cost to my crown or kingdom. The first trial was held in the Great Hall, with representatives from every major noble house in attendance, like witnesses to an execution. Lyra sat at a polished oak table in the center of the vast room, feeling like a specimen under a microscope being examined by hostile scientists. The 5 council members faced her from an elevated platform, their expressions ranging from openly skeptical to barely concealed hostile. Duke Blackwood, a silver-haired man with cold blue eyes that reminded her of winter ice, served as the chief questioner and judge. Lady Lyra, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hall with practiced authority. You stand before this distinguished assembly as our king's chosen mate, yet you demonstrably lack the traditional qualifications for such an exalted position. Please explain to this gathering why you believe yourself capable of ruling this ancient and proud kingdom. Lyra had expected this exact question and had spent the previous sleepless night crafting her response with meticulous care. Your Grace? She said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. I believe that the true ability to rule comes not from the circumstances of one's birth or breeding, but from understanding the genuine needs of the people you're sworn to serve. I may lack formal education and noble blood, but I have lived among those who struggle daily to survive, who work with their hands to build something meaningful, who worry constantly about their next meal and their children's futures. That experience has taught me compassion, resilience, and the true value of honest work. Qualities I believe are absolutely essential in any leader worth following. A murmur of interest ran through the assembled crowd like ripples on a pond. Duke Blackwood's expression remained unchanged, carved from stone. Pretty words delivered with surprising eloquence, he said dismissively, his tone dripping with condescension. But ruling a kingdom requires far more than simple empathy or good intentions. It demands intelligence, strategic thinking, the ability to make difficult decisions that may harm some to benefit many. Give us a concrete example of a time when you demonstrated these crucial leadership qualities. Lyra's mind raced frantically through her unremarkable life, searching desperately for something that would impress these powerful people who held her fate in their manicured hands. Then she remembered the fever outbreak, and suddenly she knew exactly what to say. 3 years ago, she began, her voice growing stronger with conviction. There was a deadly fever outbreak in the lower district where our Omega House was located. The city physicians refused to come because they claimed it was too dangerous and the affected people couldn't afford their considerable fees anyway. She could see she had captured their attention now, their faces focused on her words with genuine interest. Matron Vera strictly forbade any of us from leaving the house, but I couldn't stand by and watch people suffer and die when I might be able to help. So I snuck out against direct orders and spent 3 weeks organizing the healthy residents to care for the sick, establishing a systematic approach for distributing precious food and clean water, and using herbs from my garden to create remedies based on old knowledge passed down through generations. We saved dozens of lives using nothing but determination and whatever resources we could gather through our own efforts. And this demonstrates genuine leadership. How? Exactly? Duke Blackwood pressed with obvious skepticism. Because I made critical decisions when no one else would step forward. I took personal responsibility for people's lives and well-being, organized limited resources with maximum efficiency, and found creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The only real difference between that situation and ruling a kingdom is the scale of the challenge. This time, the murmur from the crowd was significantly louder, and Lyra caught several approving nods from unexpected quarters. Duke Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his composed facade. The questioning continued relentlessly for nearly 3 hours, covering everything from complex trade policies to delicate diplomatic protocol. Some questions Lyra answered brilliantly, drawing on common sense and her natural observations of human nature. Others exposed her lack of formal education painfully, making her feel foolish and inadequate before the assembled nobility. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, she began to notice something remarkable happening. The crowd's initial skepticism was slowly shifting like sand in an hourglass. When she admitted honestly that she didn't know something, but explained clearly how she would learn and seek guidance, people nodded with what appeared to be approval. When she offered practical, compassionate solutions to theoretical problems, she saw genuine respect dawning in previously hostile faces. The final question came from Countess Morwen, a sharp-eyed woman who'd remained completely silent until this crucial moment. "Lady Lyra," she said with crisp precision, "if you discovered that a decision made by the king was actively harming the people of this kingdom, would you have the personal courage to oppose him publicly, even knowing the potential consequences?" The entire hall fell silent as death itself. This was clearly an elaborate trap, carefully designed to force her to either admit she would undermine her own mate or prove she lacked the moral backbone to stand up for what was right when it truly mattered. Lyra looked up at Kieran, who sat in the royal box watching with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Then she turned back to face the Countess with newfound determination. "I would speak with him privately first," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast hall. Marriage is supposed to be a true partnership, and partners should discuss their disagreements in private before involving others or making public spectacles. But if I truly believed he was wrong, and private discussion failed to change his mind or his course, then yes, I would stand up publicly for what I believed was right, regardless of any personal cost to myself or consequences for my position. Because my duty to the people of this kingdom must always come before my own comfort, convenience, or even safety. The silence that followed stretched like a taut bowstring for what felt like hours. Then Kieran began to clap, slowly and deliberately, the sound echoing through the hall like thunder. Gradually, others joined in until the entire assembly was applauding with what sounded like genuine enthusiasm. Duke Blackwood's face remained stone as he announced through gritted teeth, "The first trial is now concluded. The council will deliberate immediately and announce our decision this evening." As the crowd began to disperse with excited chatter, Lyra remained seated at the table, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. She'd given everything she had, poured her heart and soul into every answer, but would it prove to be enough? "That was exceptionally well done," a familiar voice said beside her. She looked up to find Lord Marcus approaching, his expression unusually serious and thoughtful. "Was it enough to pass?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "For the first trial?" "I believe so. Yes." He glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard by hostile ears. "But Lyra, you need to be extremely careful going forward. Duke Blackwood looked absolutely murderous when the crowd started applauding your responses. He's not going to make the remaining trials easy or fair." "What exactly do you mean by that?" "I mean the test of worthiness is supposed to be conducted fairly and impartially, but the council has enormous discretion in how they design and implement the specific challenges. And Blackwood has never been particularly concerned with fairness when it comes to achieving his political objectives." A cold chill ran down Lyra's spine like ice water. "Are you saying he'll cheat? That he'll rig the trials against me?" "I'm saying he'll do absolutely whatever it takes to see you fail spectacularly and publicly. And you need to be fully prepared for that harsh reality." That evening, after what felt like an eternity of waiting and worrying, the council finally announced their decision. Lyra had passed the first trial by the narrow margin of 3 votes to 2. Duke Blackwood and Lord Pemberton had voted against her, but the other 3 council members had been sufficiently swayed by her performance to support her advancement. 1 trial down, 2 more to go. But as Lyra fell into an uneasy sleep that night, she couldn't shake the ominous feeling that the worst challenges still lay ahead, and that her enemies were only just beginning to show their true nature. The second trial took place in the city's main square, where a crowd of common people had gathered alongside the usual assembly of nobility. For the first time since this ordeal began, Lyra felt a genuine spark of hope. These were her people, the forgotten ones she understood better than anyone in the palace ever could. She stood before the raised platform where the council sat in judgment, their faces bearing expressions of grim determination. Duke Blackwood's satisfaction was poorly concealed as he explained the challenge that would determine her fate. "The test of character," he announced to the assembled masses, "will demonstrate whether Lady Lyra possesses the compassion and wisdom necessary to rule justly over all our people." She will be presented with 3 real scenarios, each requiring her to make a difficult decision that will affect the actual lives of our citizens. Lyra's palms grew damp with nervous perspiration, but she forced herself to stand tall and project confidence she didn't truly feel. She'd spent the previous night reading every law book and precedent case she could find in the palace library, desperately trying to prepare for whatever challenges they might present. "The first scenario," Duke Blackwood continued with barely concealed anticipation, "involves a legal dispute between 2 families of significantly different social standing. Lord Marcus Thornfield will present the details of the case." Lyra was genuinely surprised to see Marcus step forward, dressed in formal court attire rather than his usual casual elegance. He carefully avoided meeting her eyes as he began to speak in clear, measured tones. "6 months ago, the merchant family Caldwell formally accused the farming family Hartwell of deliberately stealing valuable livestock. The Hartwells deny these serious charges completely, claiming the animals wandered onto their land during the spring storms, and they cared for them in good faith, expecting compensation for their expenses. The Caldwells demand immediate return of their property, plus substantial compensation for lost income and damages. The Hartwells counter that they spent their own limited resources feeding and caring for the animals and deserve fair compensation for their efforts and expenses. Duke Blackwood turned to Lyra with an expression of false concern. Both families are present today, along with witnesses and evidence. You must hear their complete testimony and render final judgment. Your decision will be legally binding and cannot be appealed through any other court. Lyra's heart sank as the full weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. This wasn't a theoretical exercise or practice scenario. These were real people whose livelihoods and futures hung in the balance of her decision. The Caldwells spoke first, represented by Thomas Caldwell, a well-dressed merchant with soft hands and an authoritative manner that spoke of wealth and privilege. He described how 3 of his prized breeding sheep had mysteriously disappeared from his supposedly secured pen during the night, only to be discovered days later on the Hartwell farm, healthy and well-fed. They claim the animals simply wandered onto their land, he said, his voice dripping with disdain and accusation. But everyone with any sense knows that sheep don't break out of properly secured and maintained pens on their own. These people are nothing but common thieves who saw an opportunity and took it. The Hartwells presented a dramatically different version of events. William Hartwell, a weather-beaten farmer with calloused hands and dirt permanently embedded under his fingernails, spoke quietly, but with firm conviction. "Your ladyship," he said with simple dignity, "we found those sheep wandering loose and frightened in our fields 3 full days after the terrible spring storms that damaged property throughout the region. Our own fence was badly damaged in the same storms. Many animals got loose that week throughout the area. We took them in out of Christian kindness, fed them our own precious grain, gave them shelter and care. When Master Caldwell came looking several days later, we were more than happy to return them, but we asked for fair compensation for the feed and care we'd provided. That's only reasonable and just." His wife, Mary, stepped forward, clutching a carefully maintained ledger with hands that shook slightly. "I kept detailed records of everything we spent caring for those animals, my lady. We're not wealthy people by any measure. That grain cost us dearly, and we can ill afford such unexpected expenses." Lyra studied both families carefully, noting the obvious differences in their circumstances and bearing. The Caldwells were clearly prosperous, their clothes fine, and their manner confident with the assurance that comes from never knowing want. The Hartwells were just as clearly struggling, their clothes carefully patched, and their faces bearing the lines of constant worry and hard physical labor. But she also noticed something more subtle and telling. The Hartwells' children stayed close to their parents, well-behaved but relaxed and comfortable. The Caldwell children stood rigidly at attention, as if afraid to move or speak without explicit permission. "Master Caldwell," Lyra said carefully, "you mentioned that your pen was properly secured against escape. Yet you also acknowledged that this incident occurred during the violent spring storms. Was your property damaged at all during those storms?" Caldwell's jaw tightened with obvious irritation. "There was some minor damage, perhaps, but that's completely irrelevant to the matter at hand. These people are known thieves." "Known thieves?" Lyra repeated sharply. You have documented evidence of previous thefts committed by the Hartwell family? Well, no direct evidence, perhaps, but everyone in the area knows their reputation. Master Hartwell, Lyra interrupted, turning to address the farmer directly. You stated that you found the sheep 3 days after the storms ended. Can anyone verify this timeline and your actions? Aye, my lady, he replied immediately. Our neighbor Jacob witnessed us bringing them in and caring for them. And the village blacksmith can verify exactly when we purchased the extra grain to feed them properly. Lyra considered the evidence carefully, acutely aware that everyone present was watching her every expression and gesture. The legal precedent would be important for future cases, but the perception of fairness and justice was equally crucial. It seems abundantly clear to me, she said finally, that both families acted in complete good faith according to their understanding of the situation. Master Caldwell, you lost your livestock through no fault of your own when the storms damaged your property. Master Hartwell, you provided care and shelter for lost animals at considerable personal expense, as any good neighbor and decent person should do. She paused dramatically, looking between the two families with careful consideration. Therefore, I rule that the sheep should be returned immediately to Master Caldwell, as they are rightfully his property. However, Master Caldwell will fairly compensate the Hartwells for the documented cost of feed and care, as recorded in Mistress Mary's careful ledger. Additionally, both families will work together to repair the storm damage to their respective properties, because neighbors should support each other in times of need, rather than seeking to profit from misfortune. A murmur of warm approval ran through the crowd like a wave. Both families looked genuinely satisfied with the decision, and even Duke Blackwood seemed unable to find any fault with the judgment's fairness and wisdom. The second scenario proved far more emotionally challenging. A young woman named Elena, barely 18 and 7 months pregnant, had been caught stealing bread from a baker's shop. Her husband had died in a tragic mining accident, leaving her with no means of support and no family willing to help. Master Willem, the baker, demanded full punishment under the existing law, public flogging followed by imprisonment. If we allow thieves to go unpunished for any reason, he argued with righteous indignation, what's to stop everyone from stealing whatever they need or want? Elena, little more than a girl herself, stood trembling before the platform, like a leaf in the wind. Her clothes were little better than rags, her face gaunt with hunger and desperation, her swollen belly a stark reminder of the life she carried and needed to protect. Lyra felt physically sick as she contemplated the harsh reality before her. The law was absolutely clear. Theft was punishable by flogging and imprisonment, regardless of the circumstances. But how could any civilized person order a pregnant woman flogged for the crime of trying to feed herself and her unborn child?